Before I begin my little tale, I want to just reference what's happening out there right now. This was a difficult day for the nation. Again, a difficult day among many. Today, the number of new filers for unemployment hit 500,000. The third week in a row it's gone up. It's the highest level in 9 months. And it does not bode well. It could presage a double dip recession, which is something that many economists worry about, and more importantly, many citizens worry about. I'm going to give you a number that I find somewhat shocking. You know that we have been through and may still be in what is called the Great Recession, the greatest recession since the Great Depression. In its depth, in the Great Recession, there were 16 million Americans out of work. That is 2 million more than in the Great Depression. That's a bit of a shocking figure. Now, it is absolutely true that percentage-wise, it is 9.5% compared to 25%. The country was much less densely populated. But that's not much comfort to the 16 million who are out of work. So how can you tell a recession from a depression? Harry Truman had an answer. It's a recession when your neighbor loses his job. It's a depression when you lose yours. Now, these are difficult times, and no one would dispute that. But these are not the hard times, the Great Depression, and they ought not be confused with them. So where I'm going to take you this evening is on a kind of time travel 77 years ago into another place, my hometown called Canton, Ohio. That's where I grew up. The year is 1933. It's Christmas week, but it doesn't feel like Christmas. No one knows how many people are out of work. The best guess in Canton is 50%. People are starving. Along the railroad tracks, the B&O tracks, you can see kids in patched coats scavenging for coal that fell off of passing trains. There are a number of school children that have not learned the word breakfast because they never served it, and they won't learn that word for years. The orphanages and the prisons are crowded with the casualties of the hard times. 1933. This is the year someone came up with a new product. It's called Scotch tape. And in a society where people cannot afford to throw anything away and everything has to be repaired and mended, it's a godsend. This is the year that the Lone Ranger came to the airwaves to rescue the towns that could not rescue themselves. That resonated with many Americans. This is the year that a fellow named Charles Darrow, an out-of-work heating engineer in Philadelphia, came up with a new game. He called it Monopoly. It does not paint a pretty picture of capitalism. And this is the year that a new president declared, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. It did not feel that way in Canton, Ohio. Do you think we'll get out of this depression just because we got out of all the others? Asked humorist Will Rogers. Lots of folks drown that've been in the water before. It's the night of December 17th, 1933. In the First Presbyterian Church, and I want to reference the church. We're in a church. Let's go back to December 17th, 33. We're in the First Presbyterian Church, and someone is reading Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Inside, parishioners are hungry. They're fantasizing about someone coming to their rescue, as they did in the Dickens tale. It's a cold night, and the minister too feels the hard times. His salary has been cut. The benevolences, the work that the church does for the poor, has been slashed. The church funds have been lost with the failure of the bank. They're eking by on the petty cash, and attendance is dropping, and faith is shaken. That same night, a few blocks away, at the local newspaper, the Canton Repository, typesetters were putting together an ad that was going to run in the next morning's newspaper. It was a tiny ad. It wasn't any bigger than a deck of cards. But its contents would electrify the town. In the ad, a Mr. Beaverdot offers to help some of Canton's neediest in a modest way before Christmas. All they have to do is send him a letter and explain what they're going through in these difficult times. Mr. Beaverdot says in the ad that this is not his real name. No one will ever know his real name. And he will never disclose, nor will anyone else, the identities of those that write to him. His offer is so stunning in the community that it merits a front-page story in the paper, and word of it spreads for hundreds of miles. Letters pour in by the hundreds, perhaps the thousands. We don't know how many. They came from every corner of the community: the butcher, the baker, the dry cleaner, the bellhop, the bricklayer, the steel mill worker, the salesman, the bookie, the minister's assistant, an elderly widow, a 12-year-old girl, and fallen executives, many, who find themselves now with nothing. And 3 days later, some 150 checks went out across the town. The checks were for $5, and each was signed Beaverdot. Now, $5 doesn't sound like much, but back then, $5 was more like $100 today. It was more money than most people had seen in the longest time. A loaf of bread was 7 cents, a pound of ground beef, 11 cents. The minimum wage was 33 cents. But most folks counted themselves extremely lucky if they made $1 a day. For many, that week of Christmas, that gift meant the difference between not finding anything to eat and being able to provide a Christmas for the children. There was rampant speculation about who it was that was behind this Mr. Beaverdot. The years passed, decades passed, the secret remained intact. In time, Canton's forges and its shops came back to life. Prosperity returned to the city. Eventually, the memory of Beaverdot faded, and it seemed his secret would remain intact forever. Then, 2 years ago, my mother, who lives in Kennebunk, took me to her attic and handed me an old suitcase. She said she didn't know, the suitcase had belonged to her mother. She said she didn't know what was in it. Some old papers, she thought, but I was welcome to it. I took the suitcase back to a camp that we have in Bucksport, and several days later I opened it up, and I found hundreds of letters, all of them dated 1933, and a stack of checks, 150 in all, for $5. But I had no idea what I was looking at. There was no Beaverdot in my family. And so I put it all away. I closed the suitcase. I slid it back under my bed. And then several days later, I pulled it out again and started going through the letters again, the material. And I found an article, a yellowing article from the Canton Repository explaining this gift. And that's when it occurred to me. Mr. Beaverdot was my grandfather. Sam Stone was his name. And the name Beaverdot was a combination of his 3 daughters' names: Barbara, Virginia, my mother, who was here with us today, and Dotsy, hence Beaverdot. The first thing I did was I buried myself in the letters. And I read of Harry Stanley, a blacksmith out of work 2 years, who hoped his 5 small children might have something for Christmas. There was Joe Rogers, an unemployed janitor, and Charles Miner, a jobless steeplejack living on bread and coffee. Irvin Neese, a pipe fitter swamped by hospital bills and locked out from his life savings by the failure of the American Exchange Bank. There was Ethel Dickerhoff, a mother of 9, whose husband was a plumber with no work in sight. These were the voices of my hometown speaking out from the depths of the Great Depression. Some letters, like that of the painter Bill Gray, went on for 6 pages. Others were scribbled on a short piece of paper, like that of 14-year-old Helen Palm. Just a few lines. Anna DeWalt sought money to pay for her husband's funeral. August Learman hoped Christmas dinner for his 8 children might come from more than just the 2 strings of ham that he had. 14-year-old Betty Taylor had gone without a winter coat. Hazel Baum hoped to buy milk and fresh eggs to soothe her husband Edward's ulcers. Frances Lindsay secretly sought help for the family of Willis Evans, which, though down on its luck, had taken others in. Clara Brenner, a mother of 7 and wife of an out-of-work railroad brakeman, wrote hers on a postcard. Others were written on formal stationery, some of them gold embossed at the top. These were coming from businessmen who lost it all. And though their prose was polished, they were describing the lifestyle of a pauper. Black and white, foreign-born and native alike, the children of privilege and privation, all of them were leveled by the same hard times. Beaver Dot's offer was not merely about money. It was a signal to the town that someone cared, and it buoyed the spirits of many more people than the 150. It might even have saved a life. Consider the letter of J.L. White. He had once owned 2 stores and lost them both in the crash of '29. He had diligently saved his money, like so many others, and put his savings in a bank that then failed, and he lost it all. If only known at the time, he wrote. Now he was unsure how he was going to feed his 7 children. In his letter to Beaver Dot, he wrote, "Your encouraging letter and generous offer in repository of 18 December has again given me the courage to try again. Yesterday evening, just before I read your letter, was thinking of things that no person should. I am down flat, but since reading your letter, will say that I am not out yet." And there were many letters like that. I have spent the last 2 years tracking down the descendants of the letter writers, piecing together what became of them and their families. I've also investigated my grandfather's life, trying to figure out why he made the gift. Both inquiries yielded some surprises. I'm thinking, for example, of the family of Noble Wright. What a lovely name, Noble Wright. But what I discovered in reading the letter was that Noble Wright had served time in prison, something unknown to his children and grandchildren. In 1932, the year before the letter was written, he had stolen a car, a Hudson Brougham, worth $250. He was a miserable criminal. He was arrested the next day and confessed. He was 30 years old. He'd been married for 9 years. He was sentenced to 360 days in the Ohio State Penitentiary, the reformatory, with a prison population of 3,500 men, many of whom had committed their acts in desperation during the Depression. 10 months before his wife wrote to Beaver Dot, Noble Wright escaped prison. He was captured the next day, and another 4 months were added on to his sentence. But when he got out, he never wandered or strayed again. He was a model of probity. And I did tell his children and grandchildren, but I told them in the context and framework of what was happening at the time. And my job was made easier in part because of what I discovered about my own grandfather.